James walked into the luxury car dealership with a confident smile, excited to browse the latest models. He had worked hard to afford the car of his dreams, and today was the day he would finally make it happen. However, as soon as he stepped inside, the manager, a tall man in an expensive suit, gave him a dismissive look. "Sorry, sir, but we don't entertain people who aren't serious buyers," the manager said coldly, eyeing James's casual outfit. James raised an eyebrow. "I am a serious buyer." The manager scoffed. "I doubt that. These cars aren't cheap. Maybe try someplace else." James clenched his jaw but decided not to argue. He had dealt with this kind of prejudice before. With a deep breath, he turned around and walked out, disappointed but not surprised. Just as he reached the door, another man walked in, an older gentleman in a sharp gray suit, exuding authority. The manager's demeanor shifted instantly. "Welcome, sir. How can I assist you today?" The older man didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced at James, who had stopped in his tracks. He turned back to the manager and asked, "Did you just turn this young man away?" The manager hesitated. Well. I didn't think he was." "Save it," the man interrupted. "He's my son." The manager's face drained of color. "Oh. I didn't realize," the older man shook his head in disappointment. "You judged him based on how he looked. And now, you've lost 2 customers." He turned to James. "Let's go. We'll take our business elsewhere." James smiled, nodding as they walked out together. The manager stood frozen, realizing too late that his assumptions had cost him a massive sale, and his reputation. As James and his father walked out of the dealership, the manager scrambled to recover. He rushed after them, his face still pale with regret. "Wait. I made a mistake," he stammered. "Please, let's talk. I can offer a discount, a VIP experience, whatever you need." James's father, Mr. Carter, turned around slowly, his expression unreadable. "A discount," he repeated. "You think this is about money?" The manager gulped. I just want to make it right." James sighed, shaking his head. "The only way to make it right was to treat me with respect before you knew who my father was." Mr. Carter nodded. "This isn't about a car. It's about the way you judged my son without knowing a thing about him. And if this is how you treat customers who don't look wealthy enough for you, I wonder how many others you've driven away." The manager's mouth opened and closed, but he had no defense. A few customers in the showroom had started watching the exchange, whispering among themselves. The dealership staff stood awkwardly in the background, realizing their boss had just been publicly called out. James turned to his father. "Let's go. I know another place where they'll treat us right." Mr. Carter smiled. "I was thinking the same thing." As they walked toward their car, the manager stood frozen, knowing there was nothing he could say to fix what had just happened. He had lost more than a sale, he had lost his credibility. Later that day, James and his father drove off in a brand new luxury car from a different dealership, where they had been treated with nothing but respect. And as for the first dealership, word spread quickly, and in an age where customer service stories go viral in an instant, it wasn't long before the manager learned an even harsher lesson: his mistake had cost him far more than just one lost customer. In the following days, the fallout from the incident spread like wildfire. A witness at the dealership had recorded the entire exchange on their phone and uploaded it online. Within hours, the video had gone viral. People flooded the dealership's social media pages with negative reviews, calling out the manager's behavior. News outlets picked up the story, and soon, the dealership found itself at the center of a public relations nightmare. The backlash was swift. Loyal customers began canceling their appointments, and potential buyers turned to competitors who were more than happy to welcome them with open arms. The dealership's owner, a well-respected businessman, wasn't pleased when he saw what was happening. Furious, he called the manager into his office. "What the hell were you thinking?" the owner demanded, slamming a printed copy of the news article onto his desk. The headline read, "Luxury Dealership Manager Discriminates Against Customer, Faces Instant Karma." The manager, now visibly shaken, stammered, I didn't know who he was. I made a mistake." The owner leaned forward, his expression cold. "And that's the problem. You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them with respect. That man was ready to buy. And you threw him out based on his appearance. Now, because of your arrogance, we're losing business left and right." The manager swallowed hard. "I'll apologize. I'll make things right." The owner sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's too late. The damage is done." He paused before delivering the final blow. "You're fired." The manager's heart dropped. "Sir, please, pack your things and leave," the owner interrupted. "I can't afford to have someone like you representing this business." Defeated, the manager trudged out of the office, his career in ruins. Meanwhile, James and his father had moved on, enjoying their new luxury car. When James saw the viral video and how the dealership had suffered from their mistake, he simply shook his head. "Some lessons," he said with a smirk, "are learned the hard way." A few weeks passed, and life carried on for James. He enjoyed driving his new car, appreciating the respect he had received at the other dealership. But one afternoon, as he pulled into a cafe for a quick coffee, he noticed a familiar figure sitting alone on a bench outside. It was the former dealership manager. He looked nothing like the arrogant man from before. His expensive suit was gone, replaced by a wrinkled dress shirt. His shoulders were slumped, and he was staring at the ground, lost in thought. James considered ignoring him, but something inside him said otherwise. He walked over. "Hey." The manager looked up, startled. When he saw James, embarrassment flashed across his face. "Oh, it's you." James nodded. "Didn't expect to see you here." The man sighed. "Yeah, well, life's different now." James raised an eyebrow. "So, what happened after you got fired?" The manager chuckled bitterly. "Let's just say my reputation caught up with me. No dealership wanted to hire me after that mess went viral. Turns out, when people find out you judged a customer based on their skin color, they don't really want you on their team." He shook his head. "I lost everything." James studied him for a moment. He didn't feel bad for what happened, it was a consequence of the manager's own actions. But at the same time, he could see something different in him now. A kind of humility that wasn't there before. "Look," James finally said, "I don't owe you anything. But I do believe people can change, if they want to." The manager exhaled. "I've had a lot of time to think. About how I treated you. About how many people I must have treated like that without even realizing it. Losing my job forced me to see the world differently." He looked James in the eye. "I was wrong. And I'm sorry." James nodded slowly. He could see that the apology wasn't just for show. It was real. Good, James said. Now do something with that. The manager frowned. Like what? James pulled a business card from his pocket. My uncle owns a car rental company. He's always looking for people with sales experience. He's strict, though, zero tolerance for the kind of nonsense you pulled before. The manager stared at the card in disbelief. You'd really do that? After what I did? James shrugged. Like I said, people can change. But that's up to you. The manager took the card, gripping it tightly. Thank you. James gave him a small nod and turned to leave. As he walked away, he heard the former manager exhale, almost like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of a real change. A month had passed since that conversation outside the cafe. And James hadn't thought much about it since. He had given the former manager, whose name, he now remembered, was Richard, a chance. Whether he took it or not was his choice. Then, one afternoon, James received a call from his uncle. Dev, hey, I just had an interesting new hire walk into my office, Dev said. A guy named Richard. Says you sent him. James smiled. Yeah, I ran into him. He was down bad, and I figured you could use someone with sales experience. Dev chuckled. Well, he definitely knows how to sell. But I gotta say, he was nervous. Told me straight up about his past and how he lost his last job. Didn't try to sugarcoat it. That surprised James. He admitted everything. Every bit of it, Dev said. Told me he used to judge people based on appearance but learned the hard way that it was wrong. Said he wanted to prove he could do better. I respect that. James leaned back in his chair. So, did you hire him? I gave him a shot, Dev admitted. On probation, of course. I told him if I see even a hint of that old attitude, he's out the door. But so far, he's been humble. Hardworking. Even went out of his way to help a couple that other sales reps ignored because they didn't look like big spenders. James grinned. Sounds like he's learning. Looks that way, Dev agreed. People don't always get second chances, but when they do, it's up to them to prove they deserve it. James hung up the call feeling a strange sense of satisfaction. Richard's past mistakes had cost him a lot, but maybe losing everything had forced him to grow. A few weeks later, James decided to visit his uncle's car rental company to see for himself. As he walked in, he spotted Richard helping a young couple pick out a car. His posture was different, more open, more welcoming. He listened attentively, making sure they felt valued. When their conversation ended, Richard turned and spotted James watching him. A flicker of nervousness crossed his face, but James simply nodded in approval. Richard smiled, grateful, not just for the job, but for the second chance. James knew he hadn't just helped change someone's career. He had helped change someone's perspective. And sometimes, that was the most valuable lesson of all. A few more months passed. And Richard's transformation became evident. He wasn't just doing well at Dev's car rental business, he was thriving. He quickly became one of the top salesmen, not because of aggressive sales tactics, but because he had learned to treat every customer with the same respect, no matter how they looked. One evening, James stopped by the office again, this time to rent a car for a weekend trip. As he walked in, he saw Richard speaking with a young man who looked uncertain, his clothes a little worn, his hands stuffed in his pockets. Richard greeted him warmly. Looking for something affordable but reliable? The young man nodded hesitantly. Yeah. I just got a new job, but I need a car to get there. I don't have much saved up yet. Richard smiled. I've got just the thing for you. Let's take a look. James leaned against the counter, watching the scene unfold. A few months ago, Richard might have dismissed this customer, just like he had dismissed James. But now, there was no judgment in his eyes, only a genuine desire to help. As Richard walked the young man toward the lot, Dev stepped up beside James. He's different now, Dev noted. Not just at work. He's mentoring the junior employees, reminding them to never judge a customer too quickly. Even told me he's been doing some volunteer work at a youth center. James raised an eyebrow. Seriously? Dev nodded. Says he wants to give back, make up for his past mistakes. You really changed something in him. James shrugged. He changed himself. I just gave him the chance to. Dev smirked. Still, not many people would have bothered. James watched as Richard handed the young customer a set of keys, explaining the rental process with patience and encouragement. The young man smiled, clearly feeling valued. James knew then that giving Richard a second chance had been the right decision. Not because he felt sorry for him, but because everyone deserves an opportunity to be better, if they truly want it. As he turned to pick out his own rental, he couldn't help but feel that this story had come full circle. Richard had once judged James unfairly, and now he was out there making sure no one else experienced that same treatment. And that, James thought, was a victory worth more than any luxury car. A year later, James barely thought about the past incident at the luxury car dealership. Life had moved on, and so had he. But one day, while driving past the old dealership, something caught his eye, under new management sign hanging outside. Curious, he pulled into the lot. The place looked the same, but the energy felt different. Gone were the arrogant salesmen who once sneered at customers who didn't look wealthy. Instead, he saw employees helping a diverse range of customers with patience and professionalism. As he stepped inside, a familiar voice called out. James. He turned to see Richard, now dressed sharply in a professional but approachable manner. But there was no arrogance in his stance, just confidence. James raised an eyebrow. You work here again? Richard grinned. Not just working here. I'm the new manager. James blinked in surprise. Wait, you're running the place now? Richard chuckled. Yeah. Turns out, after my time at your uncle's company, word got around that I had changed. The dealership's owner, who fired me, heard about my progress. He reached out, said he wanted to fix the toxic culture here. Offered me the job if I could prove I'd do things differently. James crossed his arms. And? Are you? Richard gestured around. See. For yourself. James watched as an employee assisted an elderly woman who looked uncertain about her choices. Another salesman spoke kindly to a father and son, patiently walking them through financing options. The vibe was completely different from the day James had been thrown out. I only hire people who share my vision now, Richard continued. No more judging customers by their appearance. No more arrogance. Just good service, the way it should have been from the start. James nodded slowly. I gotta admit. I didn't see this coming. Richard smiled. Neither did I. But losing everything forced me to grow. And you? You gave me that second chance. I won't forget that. James smirked. Well, don't screw it up. Richard laughed. "Trust me, I won't." As James walked out, he glanced back one last time. The dealership that had once rejected him had transformed into something better. And in that moment, he realized that change wasn't just possible, it was powerful. A few weeks later, James received an unexpected invitation from Richard. The new manager was hosting a grand reopening event for the dealership, celebrating not only the fresh start for the business but also the new culture that had taken root. The event was designed to showcase the dealership's commitment to customer care and inclusivity, and Richard wanted James to be there as a guest of honor. When James arrived at the event, he was greeted warmly by Richard, who seemed to be glowing with pride. The dealership had been transformed, the space was open and welcoming, with friendly staff members greeting everyone with genuine smiles. Gone were the cold, impersonal sales tactics. In their place was an atmosphere of trust and transparency. Richard led James through the showroom, showing off the new cars but also highlighting how much the company had changed. He introduced James to some of the new hires, many of whom had once worked in other businesses but were drawn to the dealership because of the culture Richard had built. "None of this would have happened if I hadn't had a wake-up call," Richard said, his tone sincere. "But having people like you give me a chance, that made all the difference." James smiled. "You made the difference. You took the opportunity and ran with it. I'm just glad I could help." As the event continued, James watched people interacting with the staff, asking questions about cars and financing. Without hesitation. There was no tension in the air, no feeling that people were being judged based on what they wore or how much they looked like they could afford a high-end car. Richard's vision was coming to life in real time. Later that evening, Richard pulled James aside for a private moment. "Look," Richard began, "I know you probably didn't expect this to turn into a success story, but I wanted you to know something. That day you helped me, when you saw potential in me, it gave me a second chance, not just in business, but in life. I wasn't just selling cars anymore, I was learning how to respect people again." James nodded, moved by his words. "I didn't give you the second chance, you earned it. You're doing the work now." Richard smiled. "Maybe. But I'll never forget who opened the door for me. You don't just change one person's life in a vacuum. You change everything around them. That's what you did." As the evening wound down and the crowd began to dissipate, James stood by the exit, looking around at the faces of people who were genuinely excited about their experience at the dealership. It was clear that the change was real, not just for Richard but for everyone involved. Before leaving, James turned to Richard once more. "You know, I think you found your place now." Richard grinned. "I have. And I've learned that success doesn't just come from selling things. It comes from selling respect, honesty, and kindness. That's the real luxury." As James drove off that night, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Richard's story wasn't just about a career comeback, it was about personal transformation, the power of second chances, and the ripple effect of making the right choice. And in the end, James knew that sometimes, the best way to change the world was by simply believing in someone else when everyone else had given up on them. Months passed, and the dealership continued to flourish under Richard's leadership. Word spread quickly that the once elitist, judgmental dealership had turned into one of the most welcoming and customer-focused businesses in town. The local community began to take notice, and not just for the cars they sold, but for the positive impact Richard's philosophy had created. James dropped by one afternoon to check in and found Richard chatting with a group of young adults who had just finished a community outreach program. The group was laughing and bonding, and Richard was in the middle of it, joking and encouraging them. The dealership had become more than just a business, it was a hub for connection, where people came not only to buy cars but to engage in local initiatives that made a difference. "Didn't expect all this when I first sent you that card," James said, grinning as he approached. Richard looked up, his eyes bright. "Honestly, neither did I. But you have no idea how much these young people are learning from the programs we've partnered with. It's a ripple effect, people want to be a part of something bigger now. This place feels like more than just a job to them." James nodded, impressed. "Seems like you really turned it around." "I didn't do it alone," Richard said. "I had help from everyone here. The community is a big part of what makes this work." He paused for a moment before adding, "And if I'm being honest, I'm doing this for my own redemption too. I'm not just proving something to the people I hurt, but to myself." James chuckled. "Redemption suits you. Just make sure you're not trying to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders." Richard laughed, but there was a hint of seriousness in his eyes. "I've learned it's not about carrying the weight alone. It's about sharing it. Letting others in, letting them help me. And sometimes, it's the people who've been through the toughest things who make the best leaders." As they spoke, a mother and her teenage son walked into the dealership. Richard waved at them with a warm smile, then turned back to James. "This is where it all comes together. I see someone who needs help, who's nervous or unsure, and I can see myself in them. But I can also see the potential for change in them, just like I found it in myself." James watched Richard as he greeted the mother and son, walking them through their options without judgment, giving them time to ask questions and explore. It was obvious how much he had transformed, not just as a businessman but as a person who genuinely cared. Before leaving, James clapped Richard on the shoulder. "You've earned it. All of it." Richard smiled, looking around at his employees, the customers, and the community he had helped foster. "I'll never forget where I came from. I'll always remember what it was like to be judged and ignored. But I'll also remember what it felt like to be given a chance to prove myself. And now, I'll make sure I never stop paying it forward." As James drove away from the dealership, he realized that the story wasn't just about one man's redemption. It was about how a single moment of compassion, a simple second chance, had transformed a life, a business, and a community. And it reminded him that no matter where you start, it's where you choose to go that truly matters. "You said," ChatGPT said, as the years went by, Richard's reputation continued to grow, not just within the community but beyond it. The dealership, once just another luxury car lot, became a model of what ethical, inclusive business practices could look like. Richard's story, which had once been defined by a moment of shame and a steep climb back to respectability, had now turned into a beacon of hope for others. James kept in touch with Richard, visiting from time to time, but he'd also hear about him through mutual friends, news stories, and even social media. Richard had become an advocate for social responsibility in business, speaking at events and mentoring young entrepreneurs. His transformation had sparked something bigger than himself, and he knew that giving back was the only way forward. One afternoon, Richard reached out to James with an invitation that caught him off guard. "James, I'm organizing a charity event for the local community center, and I'd love for you to be there. You've been part of this journey, and I think it's time we give back together." James was taken aback. "Me? I didn't do anything special." Richard's reply was immediate. "You did. You saw the potential in me when no one else did. And that changed everything." The event was held at the dealership, and the turnout was overwhelming. Richard had partnered with local schools, youth groups, and businesses, all working together to raise funds for educational programs and community outreach. The event wasn't just a fundraiser, it was a celebration of the changes Richard had spearheaded and the people who had supported him along the way. When Richard stepped up to speak at the event, his voice was steady and confident, filled with gratitude for everyone who had stood by him. He shared his journey, how he had been given a second chance and had learned the true meaning of leadership, humility, and community. The truth is, I didn't just need to change as a businessman, Richard said, looking out at the crowd. I needed to change as a person. I needed to understand that success is about lifting others up, not just making profits. It's about respect, kindness, and seeing the worth in everyone, no matter where they come from. James watched from the crowd, feeling proud of the man standing before them. This wasn't just about cars anymore, it was about changing the narrative, about showing that real wealth wasn't in possessions but in the relationships you built and the impact you made. The evening was filled with laughter, heartfelt speeches, and the sharing of stories from people whose lives Richard had touched. The dealership had become a symbol not only of luxury but of integrity, and that made all the difference. As the night came to a close, James found Richard again, now surrounded by a group of young people, all eager to speak with him. Richard looked over and gave James a nod. "You did more than just give me a chance," Richard said as the crowd slowly began to disperse. "You helped me believe in myself again. And now, it's not just about the cars. It's about the lives I can help change." James smiled. "I just pointed you in the right direction. You did all the rest." Richard's eyes twinkled with gratitude. "It's the ripple effect, my friend. The kind of impact that never stops growing." And as James left the event that night, he realized that Richard had found his true purpose, not just in business but in life. It was a purpose that extended beyond the walls of the dealership, spreading through the community like a wave of hope, reminding everyone that second chances weren't just given, they were earned, and they were powerful. "You said," continued ChatGPT said, as months turned into years, the ripple effect of Richard's transformation only continued to grow. His commitment to his community, to making a difference, had become a lasting legacy. The dealership, which had once been synonymous with exclusivity and judgment, had now become a cornerstone of the community, a place where customers were welcomed and valued, no matter their background. Richard's approach to business had resonated with more people than he could have ever imagined. Other companies, even competitors, began to notice the success he had achieved by focusing on respect and kindness. Many reached out to him for advice, asking how he had turned around not just a business, but an entire culture. Richard started offering workshops on leadership, diversity, and customer service, showing others that success was not just about profits, but about how people were treated along the way. One day, Richard received a call that would take his mission even further. It was from a national business organization that wanted him to speak at a prestigious conference on leadership and ethics in business. At first, he was hesitant. The thought of speaking on a grand stage, in front of so many influential people, intimidated him. But then he remembered how far he had come, how his own story had the power to inspire. "I've come a long way from where I started," Richard said to James, who had been one of his biggest supporters. "I think it's time I shared that story with a larger audience." James smiled. "You've earned it, Richard. You've got a message worth sharing." The day of the conference arrived, and Richard stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces. He felt a wave of nerves, but also a deep sense of purpose. He began by sharing his journey, his mistakes, his growth, and the profound lessons he had learned. He spoke candidly about how he had treated people in the past, how he had learned that true leadership wasn't about control or power, but about trust, respect, and making others feel valued. "I wasn't always this person," Richard admitted, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I was quick to judge. I didn't understand the impact of my actions. But through the kindness of others, through being given a second chance, I found the strength to change. And it's because of that second chance that I'm standing here today." As he spoke, Richard could feel the energy in the room shift. He wasn't just telling a story, he was inviting others to reflect on their own actions, to consider how they could make a difference in their businesses, their communities, and their lives. By the end of his speech, the room was silent, and then, slowly, applause began to ripple through the crowd. Richard smiled, humbled by the response. He had always believed that a single moment of compassion could change the course of someone's life. And now, he had seen that it wasn't just his life that had been changed, it was the lives of many others as well. As he walked off the stage, he was greeted by people eager to talk to him, to ask questions, to learn more about how they could create their own ripple effects. Richard realized that he had only scratched the surface. The journey wasn't over, and it wasn't just about making money or running a business. It was about creating a movement that empowered others to do better, to be better. He walked outside after the event, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. Looking up at the sky, he couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come, from that moment of being fired and dismissed, to standing in front of a crowd of eager listeners, inspiring change. Richard knew that the power of second chances didn't just stop with him. It had spread, had reached others, and would continue to ripple out into the world. And in that moment, he realized he had found something far greater than success. He had found purpose. And that purpose? It was about helping others find theirs, too,